Hello, I'm Martin Farr, co-chair of Insights, Newcastle University's public lecture series. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our latest virtual lecture, Putting Disadvantaged Children at the Heart of Recovery. I'll be back in about 20 minutes after the talk to field questions and comments from you. You can do it in two ways. There's a box on the YouTube live channel where you can add your question or comment, or you can do so on Twitter. Our handle is @InsightsNCL, and you may label your comment #InsightsNCL. Here to introduce this evening's lecture is my colleague, Liz Todd, Professor of Education and Inclusion here at Newcastle.
My name is Liz Todd. I'm Professor of Educational Inclusion and Director of the Institute of Social Science. I'm really delighted today, and it gives me great pleasure and it's a privilege, to introduce the speaker for the Insights lecture that's been proposed by the North East Child Poverty Commission, the lecture on children, putting disadvantaged children at the heart of recovery, with the speaker Anne Longfield OBE. It's an absolute delight to introduce Anne, and before I do, I will just mention briefly the role of the North East Child Poverty Commission. Very important commission. It's not one that meets just briefly with a few commissioners. It has a number of commissioners and meets over time, and is absolutely central to campaigning, to putting information together, to being part of national campaigns, but being really totally embedded in the local and regional community. It's directed by Amanda Bailey, it's chaired by Jane Strether, and the patron is Right Reverend Paul Butler, Bishop of Durham. And it has a number of different commissioners. It's hosted by, but independent from Newcastle University, but well worth looking at their website. Anne Longfield, thank you so much for coming to give this lecture. We all, and I myself included, can't wait to hear what you've got to say. Putting children and young people at the heart of the recovery from the pandemic is absolutely central and absolutely totally what is necessary and what needs to happen. I direct a project in the Northeast called the Voices Project, where we are hearing what 1,000 children and young people say are their needs through and in COVID, and we've heard now 1,000 children and young people since this time last year, and we're trying to put that back into the policy making and the practices of organisations in the Northeast, but nationally and at government level and also further afield. We are learning so many things, but one of the things we've learned, which is what Anne's going to be talking to us today, is that people are indeed surprised that we need to think about putting children into these different kind of areas. We've been hearing about children, about transport, about health, about education. Of course, you'd expect that, but other things like employment and the COVID recovery, they are interested in all these different things and they need to be there. And Anne has been doing this throughout the pandemic. She's been making sure that the government know that they need to pay attention to children's needs around the digital divide, children's health needs, mental health needs, their learning needs, learning at home. She's been right there in the corridors of power, making sure that the government, in her role, in Anne's role as the Children's Commissioner for England, she's been right there in that role, and led the Children's Commissioner for England from March 2015 to February 2021. And of course, this has been through a long time to do with austerity, but particularly in the pandemic, she's really made use of that role to the very best of her ability, and continues to be a passionate champion for children and influencing and shaping national debate. So I think that's enough from me, and over to Anne.
Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. It's a particular pleasure because I'm a graduate of Newcastle University and I spent 4 happy years living in the city. And when I visit Newcastle now, which I love to do, it's obvious to me there's been some big changes and big improvements since then. But in other ways, some of the challenges facing Newcastle and the North East now are very similar to those facing many communities in the region back in the 1980s. Families really struggling with the cost of living, services struggling to cope with demand, too many children still leaving school without qualifications or many good options. And in the year before, June 2021, over a third of those unemployed in the Northeast were actually aged between 16 and 24, almost 30,000 young people. 30,000 young people unemployed at such an early stage in their working life. That's what I want to talk about today, how we can help all children in the region succeed and how we can help and ensure that the most disadvantaged children in the region are at the heart of recovery from the pandemic. And there can be little doubt that the pandemic has heightened the vulnerability of many children. But we have to understand that many of the problems existed before COVID, and many go back generations. There are already millions of children growing up in our country with a range of risks in the family home before the pandemic, from domestic violence to parental mental health or addiction issues. Local authority children's services were already having to adapt to the huge financial and social challenges that have grown as budgets have reduced and the number of children with more complex and expensive needs have entered the care system over recent years. We already had 3 million children growing up in poverty in this country. We already had food banks, even food banks in schools. Children's mental health services, non-existent or agonisingly slow or out of reach for many children in need of support. Over the last decade, spending on early intervention, Sure Start children's centres, youth work and community support has plummeted by 70% according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies, while the cost of crisis has spiralled. Whichever way you look at it, be that from a social or economic approach, it's unsustainable. Well, COVID has shone a light on so many of these problems in a stark and often cruel way. And I've argued that rebuilding after COVID needs to have children at the heart. But what does this mean in practice? What will it take for promises to level up to deliver for children in the Northeast? I spent 6 years as Children's Commissioner for England, standing up for children's rights in the corridors of power and being a strong voice for children in Whitehall and Westminster until earlier this year. Those are where many of the major decisions about children's futures are made. And during my term, I published a report called Growing Up North, which looked at whether our ambitions for children in the North matched those for children growing up in the South. And this was before levelling up was even a glint in Boris Johnson's eyes. Our report showed how new business and transport links are starting to be established, new approaches to leadership and governance beginning to be developed, and new schemes to regenerate many urban spaces increasingly visible. But when I asked what that actually meant for children that are growing up in the North today, the answer from a lot of them was, well, probably not a lot in the long term. They liked the fact that their area looked better. They liked the fact that it'd been smartened up. They liked the fact there was a prospect of buses and trains on the horizon. And they liked the fact that there were events and sometimes even openings and fireworks. But when that had all fizzled out, their fear was that nothing would really change for them. Nothing would change for their family, and nothing would change for their community. Once again, they said, it wouldn't be for people like them. So to truly make a difference, changes need to go deeper. And most importantly, changes need to be able to offer opportunity for those and real progression for those that are growing up in the context of economic disadvantage and poverty. And a poverty which still casts a long shadow over so many northern communities. For me, it's about taking bold actions to not only overcome the structural inequalities in the North, the economic capacity, industry, jobs and transport, yes, but also interventions to help children and young people flourish. If we're going to level up, we have to start with children. Now, I've spent most of my life living in the North, and I know the North isn't one place. South Shields feels a million miles away from Chester. There are hotspots of wealth, there are children growing up in affluent families, and there are schools and organisations that achieve extraordinary success. In fact, research shows that children who grow up in well-off families enjoy relative success wherever they live in the country. These children flourish in the north just like anywhere else and enjoy good life chances. But that's not always the case for the more disadvantaged children. And we know that there are more disadvantaged children and communities in the north than many other areas of the country. And many of those will have entrenched disadvantages over several generations. Disadvantage manifests itself in childhood in many ways. A lack of confidence, uncertainty and low expectation, isolated communities with narrow and poor job prospects, poor school results and poor connections to further and higher education. But it doesn't have to be the case. There are many great examples of schools boosting communication skills and confidences through languages, creative writing, public performances, visits and local heritage. There are arts, music and sports organisations that develop talent and open up opportunity. Many children in the north do well at primary age. In fact, schools in the north are some of the best in the country for children of this age. But many children fall back during the secondary years when children growing up in the areas of greatest need often underachieve. And the fact is that hundreds of thousands of children in the north face a double disadvantage, a double whammy of living in a poor community and attending a poor school. And look at what this means. Look at some of these regional differences. Children in receipt of free school meals in London are 40% more likely to get good GCSE results in maths and English and 2 times more likely to go to university than children receiving free school meals in the north. And just 34% of the 16 to 64 population in the north have NVQ level 4 and above qualifications, the lowest region in the UK. These challenges were there when I published the report 3 years ago, and since then we've had COVID. And that's turbocharged many of the existing problems that affected the north. I want our country to succeed in levelling up, and I want our northeast regions to be part of that. I want children to be able to enjoy the new era of optimism we've heard so much about over the last week. But the challenge for politicians now is that it's not just how do we level up how do we level up as a country? It's how do we level up in a post-COVID world where the disadvantage gaps between private and state pupils have grown during lockdown, where children in disadvantaged communities were out of school for the best part of a year and so often will be more likely to be suffering from bereavement or mental health problems or unemployment brought on by the pandemic. So I join the calls to put children at the heart of the recovery, but to achieve it, it will take much more than tinkering around the edges. And we need to start with an honest assessment of where we are. It's my view that the present system is failing too many vulnerable children, and too many children are living in poverty. And we can barely cope financially with the scale of challenge of those children in care, never mind those on the edge of crisis, who are often not receiving any help at all. The care system is being held together with bits of sticky tape, as the chair of the ongoing independent review into children's care, social care has said. Resources are stretched, systems are fragmented. We've got an early years and early intervention system that's patchy and often fails to spot and help those families who are really struggling. And too many children start school already dealing with speech and language problems. They're more likely to be excluded, have a social worker and struggle with reading at 11 as a result. Children's social services chiefs recently talked about children in the northeast now being taken into care, not because they're being abused or harmed alone, but because their family is too poor to look after them. And of course, not every child will grow up in poverty. It's going to be destined for a terrible childhood or to fail as an adult. But to disregard the risk is to gamble with a child's welfare and future success, with sometimes terrible consequences. Not only does poverty bring material hardship for children, it harms their future life chances. At every stage of the education system, poorer children do worse than their more affluent peers. And as a result, they're more likely to enter adulthood with fewer opportunities. Children on free school meals are more than twice as likely as their peers to leave education without a level 2 qualification. And for the first time in decades, the disadvantage gap between children in poverty and their peers during school has increased, while the disadvantage gap at age 19 has been increasing for several years. This of course, makes it even more necessary that a properly resourced catch-up plan is in place. To think that poverty can be a gateway into entering the care system, exploitation or crime is profoundly distressing, but it's also like something from a bygone Dickensian era. But it's happening now, and we risk it becoming more prevalent the higher child poverty rises. So whilst I was pleased to see the changes in universal credit announced in the budget last week, there are still too many families left worse off after recent cuts. So as a starter, I'd like to see the equivalent of the £20 uplift restored to families with children and an end to the benefits cap. But we also need to set ambitious targets for reducing poverty, as we've done in the past, putting an obligation on government to cut the numbers of children growing up in poverty. We also need, I believe, to look at how we support the most vulnerable children. These children need a joined up system that offers them support throughout childhood, not just when things go wrong. And for too long, children's social care has been a poor relation to adult social care. And while the government now accepts the need for long-term financing for the care of our elderly, there's no sign that it feels the same needs to happen for our children. It says, I think, much about the priority that children, particularly the most vulnerable children, are given in our political system. So I'd like to see our society investing in children now, but for the future. Too often it's the case that we measure the amount we spend on children, what it delivers now. And for some adult services, that can be the case, but it's not for children. And we need to look at what it can deliver across a lifetime. We need better early intervention, family hubs, building on Sure Start children's centres, a revolution in children's mental health service, starting with an NHS-funded counsellor in every school. And we need to tackle some of those core social ills that are allowing too many children to fall through the gaps into crime, gaps into in services, fall into gangs, exploitation, or underachievement. We need to reduce school exclusions, so there's an emphasis on schools and children's services and other organisations working with families to make sure children aren't kicked out of school. There are some other quick wins. Easy wins like banning under 18s in care from being housed in unregulated accommodation. But the whole system of how we care for and provide opportunities to the most vulnerable needs, in my view, an overhaul, particularly after COVID. The surge in referrals to children's social care as the COVID restrictions have been lifted gives us a reminder of some idea of the impact of lockdown on families where there are serious problems. Add in the crippling costs in terms of costs for councils, a fractured children's home market, huge backlogs in the family court system, and pressures on low-income family finances, and we've got a perfect storm brewing. The urgent task now for the government, for councils, for the providers and for charities, and for local health and police services is to develop solutions. There's no reason to expect this situation to improve without urgent intervention. Thorough reform and a target increase in funding is needed. And I truly believe that this crisis cannot be solved on the cheap. Investment, and it's an investment against the higher cost of long-term failure, remember, will be needed alongside a commitment to offer the same opportunities to the most vulnerable children as we would expect for our own. The alternative, I fear, is an endless spiral of crises that grow ever more damaging, wasteful to children's lives, and expensive to solve. Recently, I launched my own year-long independent commission into how we can turn around the lives of teenagers at risk. It's hosted by the Oasis Charitable Trust, an organisation who's done some excellent grassroots work with vulnerable children over the years. And we'll be offering government and councils practical, affordable solutions to keep children at risk safer and to support marginalised children to succeed. So if we're serious about levelling up, and we're serious about putting children at the heart of the COVID recovery, we need to be serious about the huge scale of the challenges. We need our politicians to wake up. The overrepresentation of adults who grew up in care, in our prisons, sleeping on our streets and struggling with addiction and mental health problems, it tells its own story of the failure to invest in vulnerable children. And no government hoping to level up opportunities in society can afford to ignore the issues facing thousands and thousands of vulnerable children, including children growing up in the Northeast. No child should have to live with the risk of harm we're seeing. And no child should have to live with that risk because of the lack of a political will that I believe we have at the moment to fix a broken system for vulnerable children. Thank you.
We're here live with our speaker, and welcome to Insights.
Thank you.
I'm guessing you, like the rest of us, had an inkling of the size of the challenge we faced in March 2020 when the pandemic became a reality and lockdown occurred. What were your expectations, your fears perhaps originally, and how did they come to be fulfilled, possibly exceeded?
Well, I was actually oddly in Norway when they locked down. We were going on a field trip there to look at their social care because they were, further ahead of us. The thing that struck me with that is it went so fast, literally in about 24 hours. It went from something that might happen in the future to actually everything was locked down. So that was a kind of early indication that something enormous was going to happen. Of course, I came back to Britain and we were still shoving ourselves on tubes and trains for another 10 days or so. But that was kind of an early shock of that. I remember seeing the kids coming home from school that last day with their piles of books in their hands out of the, I was working at home by then. And that seemed kind of momentous, really. They didn't know what was happening. And then, of course, everyone went into lockdown. It was kind of 1 or 2 weeks in that I think we as a team realised back then, I was Children's Commissioner, that actually this was going to be a period of enormous challenge where we needed really to get very much on it in terms of monitoring and understanding what's going on, in terms of really ensuring, children's experience came through and children's needs and rights were being kind of recognized as these kind of momentous decisions were being made. But it also was very quickly clear that it really shone quite a cruel and stark spotlight on the many vulnerabilities that, we'd been talking about for an awful long time, and I'd been saying really need to be recognized. And they were there now absolutely before us. We could see that there were huge differences in kids' lives as they grow up, from families that had big gardens and, two parents at home working and loads of desks, loads of laptops, all the rest, and those that were 4 siblings to a bed, and there was a lot of vulnerabilities in the home, and there were no outside space, and they were sharing their mum's cracked phone. So it became very obvious there was going to be a big difference. I think that experience, much discussed about what it meant in terms of children falling back in education, isolation, mental health, all the rest of that. I think the scars for what the impact of the pandemic have been aren't totally recognised. It's not just something that a bit of tutoring can catch up. It's not something which is going to be helped with just a quick visit from a mental health counsellor. Those scars potentially for those kids that were most vulnerable beforehand, I think, will be there for a long time unless we really respond with the scale of the level of support that I think is needed.
In terms of scale, taking the longer view, because I know you're a historian by training, what size and what scale has this pandemic been in terms of the impact it has on young people?
Well, of course, it's just playing out now. We know that the disadvantage gap for children has expanded during this time. The disadvantage gap in education at 16 years old was already 18 months. 40% of that already happened before school, so it sets in early. That has expanded by about 7 months. There are huge disparities. There's one particular figure, which is the disadvantage gap, the amount children fell behind in their maths at 16 was 2.5 months in London. In the Northeast, it was 5 months, because you got children who were already out of school for longer, higher level of infections and the like, and less of a kind of, the school systems in the Northeast were already way behind in terms of London and the Southeast. So I think it is already of enormous significance in a historical context to how children, experience that and see the world. And in education terms, it's simply the biggest disruption since World War II. And I think we need to look back on that. And interestingly, there was a 10-minute rule bill, which don't often come into being, that Robert Halford MP put forward yesterday, which was trying to say that actually in an emergency of the future, we should protect schools and educational establishments against closing. And there was one moment back in May and June where actually Primark owned, theme parks owned, pubs owned, and zoos owned, but schools stayed shut. And there was only a set amount of socializing that could go on before the numbers raced up, and schools missed out. And that for me was the wrong choice.
It's significant. The First World War with the Fisher Act, the Second World War with the Butler Act. The war was a galvanizing experience for the belief in education as a positive good.
Yeah.
Some questions are coming in, which is wonderful. You can add your questions to the YouTube channel in the chat box or on Insights at Insights NCL. Jane, the chair of the North East Child Poverty Commission, asks, you have previously been supportive of the concept of family hubs, particularly in the role that they could play in coordinating services for vulnerable families and children. Do you share concerns, however, that despite the new funding announced last week, family hubs don't come close to matching the ambition, funding, scope or principles of family and community engagement of the Sure Start Children's Centres programmes? And can family hubs have a meaningful impact when we still have ever-increasing numbers of children, particularly in the North East, growing up in poverty?
Okay, so I've always been, thanks for that question, that's dear to my heart. And, I was so embedded in the development of Sure Start 20 odd years ago. I know far too much about, how many numbers there were, how many this was at various times and the like. I campaigned for it. I went into the Prime Minister's strategy unit to help work out how it could happen, and ran some of them as well from the charity after that, and remain, convinced that they are the model that is needed. Joined up services, help for families early on, near to home, in the most disadvantaged communities, but also wider than that. The one thing that I wanted more from Sure Start was I wanted to go across the age range. I didn't want to stop at 5. I actually wanted that to be a family support model that went up to children at 19. So the ones that I ran, or at least some of them with the charity, were actually 0 to 19s, and I added that on. So the concept of family hubs, if you look at it in terms of the age range, that's a good thing. I want to see that. However, Sure Start, we described that as, the new frontier of the welfare state at that point. We were talking about significant amounts of investment. 1.8 billion in the last year alone went into Sure Start, 3,500 Sure Starts around the country. The numbers are varying how less they are now, probably at least 1,000, if not 1,500 less, and also much reduced in terms of what goes on there. So they don't compare at the moment, if you like. So in content terms, in terms of the extent of the age range, I think is a good thing to extend it. But I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel. We have good models there already in terms of Sure Start, and the additional money is pretty much transformational money onto that to add a few years. I really want to see that funding going back to 2010 levels, and to get back onto a proper momentum of having joined up support for families in local areas. Until we do that, I think we are looking at we're looking at reduced options for families who desperately need it. So with money that's been announced so far, of course, I'm happy to see some money. But actually, we need to see, really, there's an opportunity lost if we don't go back to what we had in terms of scale of ambition. And we aren't seeing that at the moment in terms of family hubs.
In a way, Sure Start was profound in shifting people's attitudes as to what requires investment and the priority of investment in early years. And so even with austerity and so on afterwards, that's remained a priority for policymakers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was an immense commitment. Interestingly, the Treasury actually led that development. It was a Treasury that decided we needed to have, more support and early intervention for families and for children, and also that the, first years of life were really important. And they set a senior civil servant on the case to go and look at how this could be delivered. They looked at Head Start in the US and looked at what we could do with that, piloted it, built on that and the like. So it wasn't something that just kind of fell out of the air. And, there's been various kind of criticisms like, it was all for middle class families, or, there were too many of them. Well, those are all things that can be dealt with. And, there often weren't that many middle class families that were kind of going to the ones on the outskirts of kind of urban areas and estates. So, I think that those were unfair criticisms within that. But the scale of that change was something which had the potential, I think, to put, it really recognised that, children and families needed public support, or we all benefited if we actually could support families and support children. It wasn't just a private matter. If you had things going on at home, actually, there was a social good there that we could all benefit from by supporting those families. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I know a lot of areas have tried desperately to hold on to, some more successful than others, but actually is something which we're seeing the impact of not having at the moment, I believe, because actually the cost of a lot of the services for children has remained very high for councils and others, because they're having to spend a lot on crisis, because crisis is very, very expensive. So we need to get a bridge back into investing early and to be able to support those families and avoid crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it was a paradigm shift to the benefit of all. On the issue of funding, we have a question from Twitter. Responding to last week's budget, the National Children's Bureau commented that, quote, while money for public services is vital, high rates of poverty remain an insurmountable barrier to levelling up opportunities for children, end quote. What do we need to do to get government to acknowledge and address this issue if the levelling up agenda is to be meaningful, particularly for children in the North East?
Well, it is a huge hole at the moment, I think. There simply isn't a poverty strategy. There used to be a poverty unit in government that sat between DWP and DFE, and that's not there anymore. So there is a hole, I believe, and I don't see the interest in filling that gap at the moment. I've said before that I think there's a bit of squeamishness about talking about poverty, you know, as though it's something which happens over here and we can't do, you know, we can't do much about. There's a bit of response now and again when, you know, Marcus Rashford shouts loudly, but it's all very much kind of a pragmatic response. I mean, my argument really is that not only should we do it in moral terms, but economically, it makes no sense to continue to look at the cost of poverty for everyone involved. And, you know, we should have confidence that there is something that government not only can do about it, but should do about it. Governments can reduce poverty and governments should reduce poverty. And to not do that is not only letting down those individuals, but the wider society, because we'll pay the price. So someone asked me something last week, you know, do I accept that actually more of the pie is going to go to, you know, older social care because, you know, the population's getting older and there just won't be enough money left? And the answer is no. Not only should it go to young people as part of that, but also it could, but we need to build that pie. You know, we need to help those young people flourish. We need to help them progress and succeed in life. And there's economic benefits for that, for everyone. But it won't happen if we just leave the situation as it is. It won't settle in a good place.
Poverty. Rather stark to be discussing such a concept in 21st century Britain. We have two questions on poverty. Margaret asks, what do you think about a universal basic income helping to reduce child poverty and family stress?
Well, I mean, I think all things should be on the table in terms of looking at how we reduce poverty. And when you look at the figures in the North East, they are particularly stark and particularly increasing as well. But, you know, I really think there are a number of ways that we need to tackle it and tackle it fast. One of those obviously is financial means and partly by financial transfer with that. And for sure, the welfare system has to be strong enough to be able to support families who are in poverty and support children in poverty. And that means changes. So, you know, I agreed with the submission to the spending review from the North East that talked about increasing child benefit, you know, keeping the uplift. I'd like that to be the equivalent now to be reinstated, to get rid of the 2 children cap. All of those things need to change, and a much greater emphasis, I think, on children and families within the benefit system. We don't have that at the moment, and I think that needs to change. But I think at the other side as well, what Sure Start was trying to do was really lift families out of poverty through supporting them to flourish, through supporting them to be able to work and the like. So I think a poverty strategy needs to have many strands across government, including housing, including clearly within DWP, including within health and within education. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is we just don't have a strategy, not only for poverty, but for vulnerable children across government. And that's what I think it will take, really. And my fear is that levelling up just won't be able to get to reach the parts it needs to reach without some serious work and leadership and intervention in reducing poverty and really providing that kind of springboard that those children living in poor areas need. And there was that stat that actually in the speech I used about the difference education in London has made over the last 10 years. There's been a big investment in London schools over 15 years ago. And now those children on free school meals in London are 4 times as likely to get those good GCSE results in maths and English, twice as likely to go to university as those in the north. And we need to have, we need to be incensed, if you like, I think, that actually that same level of intervention and priority isn't given to children in the north.
I mean, the pandemic has demonstrated all sorts of disparities, not least with devolution and with the nations. And our second question on poverty comes from Twitter. For some time, there has been cross-party consensus on child poverty in Scotland, including the need for a national strategy, targets and income-based measures. Why do you think it's been possible to secure and sustain that cross-party consensus in Scotland, but not in England?
There's also been more in Wales, actually, as well. So I just think you have a completely different political climate in those countries where devolution itself has created a much clearer focus on, the mechanisms within the country as a whole. I think also the scale of size of the country and the population helps within that as well. And that sense that actually they can remedy what they see as some of the some of the problems that are coming out of the UK as a whole. But I think there is much more of a sense of collective responsibility in those countries. I think that what we have is a much fiercer party system in this country. It's much more adversarial in terms of the debate that takes place. And, there has been a strong reaction from some of the social interventions, social policy interventions that were put in place over the Blair-Brown years. I do think that the introduction of things like the family hubs now is an acknowledgement that they are needed and necessary, and by definition, actually, that it was a mistake to go after them to reduce that funding early on. Of course, what happened was that the ring fence was taken off, and then it's down to everyone else. And with local authorities with vastly dwindling budgets, they've been forced into some of those positions. But, I think that there has been quite a knee-jerk reaction to some of those social policy interventions. And actually, I am an optimist. So at this stage, I would say there's the potential that you can start to rebuild some of that consensus back into more of the place it needs to be. I'm not saying it's going to get to the place where I think it needs to be, but at least reverse some of those distances moving away from that. But it has to be made to happen.
We have a question that follows on beautifully from your point about culture in England. Steve asks, do you think our approach to education in England is compassionate enough?
Well, my answer is probably no. I think that we've got to the point where over the last few years where the emphasis has been on outcomes in terms of grades. That's been a clear driver with clear incentives for schools and those leading schools, and it's been backed up by the regulator as well. Now, look, I want children to succeed in schools just as much as everyone else. I want them all to get good grades, but I think the cost of that for those children that haven't been the ones that are likely to get those grades has been high. We have a system where 20% of kids leave school without getting a decent grade at age 16. They don't even pass the place where they would need to be able to get onto many apprenticeships. So I think a system which accepts that 20% will fail isn't acceptable. If you went to a manufacturing firm and said that you were going to have 20% of whatever product they were making that have to throw away, they wouldn't tolerate it. It wouldn't be tolerated, but yet we do in our education system. So I think we need a wholesale shift about what we do about that. And then I do think we have to change what we measure around schools. And it shouldn't be just around educational outcome in terms of grades. It should be about progression for children. It should be about the support for children with special educational needs, and it should be about well-being as well. And that's not to say that, you know, schools can do everything. I think there is a point here where you have to wrap services and support around schools to enable that to happen. But I don't think that we can carry on with the system we have and accept that 20% of children just aren't going to be able to have the fulfilled life that we would all wish them to have. And bringing that back to levelling up, you know, we've taken this decision over the last few years. We're an independent country now. We have to, you know, we have to look after ourselves in the world ahead. When you do that, you have to build on your assets. And children are those assets. Young people are those assets. So we have to look after them and grow them. For me, it's as simple as that.
And what role should these assets have? Jess asks, how could we become better at listening to young people?
Yeah, and again, I think this comes back to the culture of the country. I mean, I said earlier that I was in Norway when the pandemic broke out, and there, within a matter of days, their prime minister was on the screen having a press briefing just for kids, saying, you know, we know it's scary for you. You're important to us. We're going to keep you informed. You know, everyone's going to do everything they can. And they carried on doing that throughout the pandemic. And much as I pushed for that here, we couldn't get that to take place. And I think that when you look at countries, and Scandinavia is not perfect, but, you know, they are way down the line in terms of where they put children in the priority list, you see a different approach, and you see one that thinks about children, listens to them, and really puts them at the forefront of the list of priorities. And we haven't got that here. It's one that, you know, there is a movement towards, but we are really way off in terms of how we make that happen. We don't have to wait for government for that. We can do it locally. We can do it in many ways. We can do it in our institutions. But actually, there is a role there for government to lead some of that. And clearly, that's something that I'd like to see.
It has been quite emotional teaching at university, having second years who've never met any of us before or been on campus before, and to try to compensate for the last year, and first years, of course, freshers who have had the last year and a half in sixth form on Zoom. Are you concerned about the long-term consequences of this 10 years down the line for this cohort coming through to university in 10 years' time?
Yeah, I am, both in terms of what they've experienced, but also what that's meant in terms of the shock. You know, I said before about, you know, when schools were kept closed in May, June time. Well, I think like everyone else, you know, you assume schools are all going to be there. You assume this is the path life's going to take. You assume that exams will happen. You'll assume you'll have choices. Well, actually, that's all been shaken up in the air. And I think that is part of the pressure on children that's really affected their mental health. You know, what can we rely on? And when it comes down to it, you know, we're not that well prepared for an emergency in terms of really ensuring that children are understood and put first in terms of their needs. So I do think that has had a big impact, and that has really knocked a lot of kids' confidence about the future, in terms of, you know, where they see themselves in the future. I think, again, there needs to be that real springboard in place for 16, 19-year-olds to help them. But one thing someone else has told me, for those children that probably, you know, had all sorts of vulnerabilities before, they're seeing things come through now. It's more extreme and it's more frequent, but also levels of anxiety where some children are, you know, not wanting to leave home. You know, there's that separation anxiety. One thing that a school was saying they've seen a lot is how children are really worried about eating in front of other kids, and they won't eat stuff that actually, you know, hasn't been prepared at home. So I think it goes deep and it goes long, which is why I've always said that, you know, the catch up, well, call it recovery, whatever, the childhood recovery program, you know, needs to have its own kind of Nightingale status, but we haven't really seen that.
I've had first years, because of the way the A-level results were determined, who have imposter syndrome and new anxieties about whether they should be at university in the first place based on the grades and how they were attained. So there are whole new levels of anxiety adding to the mental health issues we had even before the pandemic. Sophie has another question on poverty. She asks, what's the single most important thing that needs to happen to bring the number of children living in poverty in the North down?
Well, I would say that the quickest route, of course, is through the welfare system. So child benefit system to increase child benefit, also compensate for those families who have lost out through the cut of the uplift, and the other support in place for families, and the two-child cap. Those are the things you can get quickest to in terms of quickest results. But I do think then it's a long-term haul to put them at the forefront in terms of support locally, to put them at the forefront of education catch-up, and then to really inject the kind of support in place to really help them through school and help those families into work. I just think that it needs a major intervention which has visibility, resources behind it, momentum, that people feel things have changed and are changing. But that will take an immense commitment.
We have a very good question from Fred, which will serve as our concluding question. He asks, what would you say the most important lesson you've learned is as Children's Commissioner?
Whoa. I think really, and I learned this as well way before I was Children's Commissioner, but you always think and then you really get tested and it's a lot bigger than it was, is first of all, there's several. So government isn't one thing. The government's made up of individuals, all of which have different views and different priorities, and it's a constant kind of scramble of who's getting their views through at any point. Persistence is all, because you're never going to get what you want first time. But the other thing is really, and I think given the audience this is good, have your evidence there and just keep building on it, because you won't get where you want to be the first time, but it's the evidence that wins. And that needs to be persistent and strong, because there's always another game in town. You think you've won the game, but actually there's always some other emergency. Either it's a soft option or whatever. It's not hard enough economically. So I think the thing I've learned is that you have to be in it for the long game. And, if big block comes in front of you, which it will, you just have to go around it and carry on.
On that note, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much, Anne Longfield. And to our viewers, thank you for watching. Our next event will be on Tuesday, the 9th of November, when we have Tim Harford speaking on how to make the world add up. We hope you can join us then.